Okay, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am really excited to talk about cybersecurity with some amazing experts in the field. And we're going to be talking about something that is incredibly timely with some recent major attacks that have been happening. Anytime you talk about some of the more advanced attacks, when you look at what nation state attackers are doing, and specifically when you think about how you as an enterprise, or we as enterprises, we as software companies respond to these types of incidents, I think it's going to be a really interesting, fun, and hopefully practical discussion. The attack on the U.S. service providers over the last significant period of time, but was discovered last fall, and then recently, being someone who's been in networking for a long time, seeing organizations like the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency issuing new guidelines around how to secure networks effectively. Really exciting and interesting time to be in networking, and obviously lots of practical things that we need to be thinking about as IT professionals in terms of how we respond, how we secure our organizations. And it really gives us an opportunity just to frame some interesting conversations. So quick introductions around the horn. My name's Chris McHenry. I lead product at Aviatrix. I've been in the networking and network security space for almost 20 years now. Spent about 14 years at Cisco before this. Have been at Aviatrix for the last 3 years. Joining me today are two really amazing experts in the security space. John Shin, who is our CISO here at Aviatrix. John, I'll let you introduce yourself real quickly.
Sure. I joined Aviatrix back in September. I'm the CISO for the company, responsible for security of the company, as well as our multi-cloud networking product. Before joining Aviatrix, I was at Zoom for 4 years, responsible for the Zoom security of the client, cloud infrastructure, critical IT applications. And before that, I was at Cisco Systems as well for 20 years. I spent about half that time working on as a developer working on security products, so like our firewall, IPS, ISR security features. And then the latter half of my career there, mostly focused in Accenture security org, improving the security posture of the company. So great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And Sarmed, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Sarmed Faraj. I'm part of the Accenture cybersecurity team. I have been with Accenture for over 4 years in the Zero Trust security team. Prior to that, I spent over 6+ years in the security and also part of the C-level management, but hands-on always on the IT. In the last year and a half, I've been lucky. I've been part of the team working on EMA regions, mostly Europe and the Gulf, traveling around. I'm really excited to be here in town, but mostly my really exciting project been to see outside of the US how, other part of the world dealing with the current security threats, helping them around, especially in the Gulf region, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, while they're expanding a lot in that region. And the cloud is very new to them, and trying to secure all that with the new avenue, new security threat, and so on. Happy to be here, and glad to be part of the team. And back to you, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's dive into it. We're going to start out just by kind of breaking down what was the Salt Typhoon attack on the U.S. service providers. Really, what is Salt Typhoon? And then we'll take a look at some of the interesting outcomes from it that I think are going to be important as they influence the way that we design IT infrastructure, think about our security posture. So a couple of really interesting things here. First, Salt Typhoon is really, it's not an attack, it's not a vulnerability, it's not, something that, along those lines. Salt Typhoon is really a name that we have for an advanced persistent threat, oftentimes associated with nation states, likely associated with China. And anytime we think about APTs or advanced persistent threats, we're talking about the best of the best. And they're typically using a suite of mechanisms to exploit highly sensitive environments. Now, what was really, really interesting. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the methods that they used. But what's really, really interesting here is that this particular attack and why it requires us to think about what we're doing was on the US service provider infrastructure. So these shared infrastructure companies, the ones that we as enterprises use to build our networking backbones, the ones that allow us to connect our remote sites together or connect to the cloud or connect to colos or connect our data centers together. These were the infrastructures that were penetrated. Now, in the context of the most high profile attack that was publicized last fall, it was primarily focused on exploiting a specific part of the service provider infrastructure that was the wiretapping infrastructure. And some obvious implications there. But the broader piece that is interesting about this, and I think what is really driving some of the new guidelines coming from CISA and the NSA, is the fact that this organization, as they started to do forensics on the attack, turns out that they were very, very deeply embedded in the service providers. And it causes us to think about how do we treat third parties, especially third parties that are critical to our networks. How do we do things like take ownership of our security, ensure we have appropriate visibility, because those shared service providers, and we'll talk a little bit about the shared security model, really, really interesting to think about how we can take ownership, how we can impact our own security while still partnering with these third parties. Some of the risks that are involved here, right? When we think about third parties and what portions they play in our network is ensuring that we have visibility into what's happening. And anytime you send your traffic out of your own control, we risk not having visibility and consequently thinking about how do we detect threats, how do we respond to threats, and understand the impact potentially there. Another component of this is thinking about where our data is encrypted. We've been talking about encryption as IT organizations for a long time. This is not the first time that we've seen a push around making sure that your data is appropriately encrypted across all of the links that you don't fully control. But this is a critical reminder that that's incredibly important. In my space, and we'll talk a little bit more about this oftentimes come in those connections that you have for your hybrid cloud, where you're connecting your data centers to the cloud, connecting your remote sites to the cloud potentially. And we have a lot of private circuits that we might be leasing from service providers that may or may not have encryption. That's an important place to think about how do we approach those problems. We'll dive into that a little bit deeper later. And then thinking about like, what is that? Where does that trust boundary lie, and how do we treat it? And one of the common principles in cybersecurity over the last several years has really been zero trust. What does that actually mean? How do we take that posture, especially when it comes to third party connectivity, but also in this sense, thinking about the third parties that our network traffic is riding on top of, and are there things that we can do to ensure that we have the appropriate levels of trust, or that we mitigate any concerns around trust in a third party. The key here that's really, really important is that we don't take this seriously. It can have a significant impact on the business. And that's something that we're going to dive into a little bit more. And I will pass, with that, I want to defer to some of the experts here. So, I think this is really yet another wake-up call. But John, as a CISO, would love to get your thoughts on like, what did this particular attack reveal about some of the risks that you see in enterprise networks, and specifically coming from your perspective?
Yeah, so absolutely. So there are two classes of risk that jumps out at me. The first one is actually compliance risk. So as many of you know, encryption of sensitive data in transit, that's a core control in many certifications and regulatory requirements, right? Like ISO 27001, GDPR, PCI. In that hybrid environment that Chris just described, enterprise often rely on encryption provided by service providers as part of the solution, without really fully understanding the actual security guarantee. So the example Chris gave in the private links, if you're using AWS Direct Connect, you might enable something like MACsec. But without realizing that traffic is actually decrypted at every hop within the service provider's infrastructure. So Salt Typhoon incident, it really underscores the risk of this type of approach, revealing how attacker can exploit vulnerabilities in the networking devices to intercept the decrypted data to exfiltrate the decrypted data. So as a CISO, or any company, if you're in this situation, claiming that your traffic is encrypted in transit is actually a misrepresentation of your security posture. And this can lead to non-compliance with certification or regulatory requirements. Worse yet, I think, it will attract scrutiny from FTC. They don't take kindly to misrepresentation of security posture, especially in terms of encryption, right? You could result in FTC fines or consent orders. And having worked in a situation where under FTC consent order, it's a very heavy toll on the company. That's something you want to avoid. So I would encourage, call to action. I'll encourage all enterprises to review their security posture related to encryption. Make sure you're representing your security posture accurately, and then most importantly, protecting your customer sensitive data. The second class of risk I can see is just kind of a lack of general security best practice in networking, configuration, and access. So even though this attack was against telco, this applies to enterprise as well, right? So the lack of proper network segmentation that enable lateral movements once the attacker got in. Sort of the lack of reduction of attack surface, right? Many of the management interfaces were open to the internet. So that made your attack surface much wider. And then to make things worse, many of these management interfaces had default credentials, misconfigurations, which allow very easy access for the attacker. So in terms of what Salt Typhoon revealed about how the attackers are getting in, right? So I think with any attack, your adversaries are looking at the weakest points in your environment, right? So within the hybrid multi-cloud environment, they're targeting places with least visibility for the enterprise. So in this case, kind of the service provider environment. So some of the key weaknesses they used was things like unpatched VPNs, firewalls, routers. And once they got in, they were able to essentially exfiltrate the data or spread out laterally. Let's see. And then finally, the similar attacks evolving in the future, I definitely think this will be the trend. The industry trend is moving toward continued growth of hybrid and multi-cloud environments, which means the complexity is here to stay. As a result, this type of attack we can expect to evolve and grow in sophistication. So to prepare for these, some of the best practice, right? Your common security best practice, make sure you patch on time. Like I said before, review your end-to-end encryption strategy and implementation. Implement network security best practices like segmentation. Make sure you have continuous monitoring and anomaly detection across all your environments. And also make sure you understand the shared responsibility with the service provider, right? Understanding their security model, how you can leverage that, and what are the gaps, and how you can enhance those. And just to give everybody kind of a sense of the scope, right? There's over 100,000 compromised routers. Somebody that used to work at Cisco, that's just an incredible number. And then 240,000 vulnerabilities. And I really like this quote by Jen Easterly, the CISA director, right? So the edge devices are like routers and firewalls and switches. There's the connectivity tissues, but there are also the soft underbellies that's being leveraged by our adversaries.
And I want to dive in a little bit deeper to some of the things that you said, John. We'll push that a little bit later in the discussion. But your comments around best practices, I think, are really, really interesting. That's, again, one of the things that I think is so interesting, exciting, and action-oriented around this particular incident is that it caused new recommendations from CISA, from the NSA, from there was an executive directive on how to handle IT security as a response to Salt Typhoon. But and the comment around like the connective tissue and the soft underbelly, really, really interesting. From my perspective, right, as I lead product, and from your perspective as you own product security here at Aviatrix, like there's a huge responsibility that we have, right, to ensure that our customers. I don't take that lightly at all. At the same time, it's very interesting because you think about these networks that, if I rewind to how we built networks maybe 15 years ago, and MPLS was an incredibly popular technology, and you just kind of assumed, oh yeah, it's private, like that's there, but there's really 15 different routers that are in between one hop and another hop, and maybe you're using like a VLAN tag as segmentation, an MPLS tag as segmentation. That if one of those routers in the middle is compromised that you don't own, right? You don't even have visibility into it. You can't see it. We need to really think about like how can we take that trust back into our own hands, and so you mentioned the shared security model again. We'll dive into that a little bit deeper, but really great insight. So Sarmed, I'd love to pass it over to you. You see this kind of broadly from. I'm a big believer that the network is critically important to security. I oftentimes put these jokes in presentations where it's like, okay, well, if we want to secure things, the best way to do it is to cut the cord to the internet. Don't have a network and things might not get compromised. It's a lot harder. But that's obviously not practical from a business perspective. So would love to get your perspective on what you see as some of the most common network security challenges. And like practicality, I think, is really helpful here because we can't disconnect ourselves from the internet. So what do you see as some of these challenges? And maybe we can walk through kind of how networks generally get compromised and maybe how we should be thinking about that from a defensive perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely, absolutely. So, the playing field really what we look into, and we mostly, and our security trend, sadly, is either we come in to do an assessment for a reason of a CISO change of, a new CISO and need to do assessment, or the company already hacked and we coming in, they can't access anything and we need to come in and secure everything and put everything together. Either way, after they back in business, whether they hacked and we get them partially back in business or we do an assessment, we normally ask the question to be honest with you. Like first we ask the question, just like when you go to doctor's office, like, what level pain you are in. Well, the same thing in security. What level do you think you are? What tiers you are? And we usually categorize these in 3 tiers, And most, tier 1, which is like risk, tier 2, risk informed, and then, tier 4 is like adaptive. We are already adaptive. And most of them think they are tier 4. When we get to the bottom of it, we find out they have the tools, but they don't have the tool visibility. Or they have the tool visibility, they have way too much noise. They don't know what to go through or after. And that's really most of the time is the issue. I've seen a lot of companies have misunderstanding of what zero trust is. And they think zero trust, we always educate people like the zero trust is not going and buying a tool, hey, this is zero trust, we're gonna go with this tool. Zero trust is really changing the fundamental of what can access your crown jewel. That's bottom line. Everybody talking about the crown jewel of my data. I mean, if we look back in early days where we all think it was the hacking through Outlook, they got your email and they spam everybody with emails and that was the hack. The playing field got completely changed with the cryptocurrency now, whatever. People hack you, ask for money and exploit your opportunity and saying, we're not gonna release anything, put you back in business unless you give us some money. That was not the trend back in the early days. That was the trend. So when that changed and gave the opportunity for people, people got invested into a lot of, constantly they work 24/7 trying to find out where the vulnerability is. And most of the vulnerability coming in, we've seen it is in the third party. And I'm not talking about third party access, whatever. I'm talking third party, even IoT devices. Industry. If you look at the healthcare industry, stuff like that, you have a machine that treats cancer patient, whatever. These machines develop to do certain things in the health industry, or CNC machine to do certain things in the manufacturing industry. They're really, no matter how much they do, they communicate on a layer 2. They do the encryption layer 2 and they think that's it, we're done. And guess what? The vulnerability of DHCP and ARP and stuff like that is coming to hit them right now. And they're like, well, what do we do with this? And most of the time it goes back to basic. Limit access. Understand, manage the risk strategy. do network segmentation. And, we notice with this thing, it's not really just the internet. It's the traffic, once it leaves layer 2, it goes to layer 3, whatever, across the LAN to different LAN environment, you have vulnerability. And if you're not looking into that vulnerability and you're not doing your segmentation and you're limiting, I'm saying, well, this device is only going to communicate here and is only need access right here. If any branch in a hospital coming in, I am going to monitor this and I'm going to make sure the access is limited to this. And that's where we see the failure. Like they'll do zero trust, whatever, and all of a sudden a new device comes in. Yeah, just allow it to do so-and-so, give it a DHCP or give it static IP and stuff. And then, let's just remember, it's just really the layer 2 specification of it, the standard, the MACsec, it just standardized in 2006. It just, where all the vulnerability was from other things. So it's fairly new. A lot of companies struggling with it. So I'm trying to open everyone's mind and thinking, this is not just wide area network or cloud. Okay, I'm not in cloud. I don't need to worry about it. Well, actually, no. It is when you have multi-connection in your LAN and you have network traveling from one segment to another, you need to make sure you have true visibility into that. And that's what really coming in and going back to detecting the noise and really having a pan view from all these security where you can truly look at them every day and saying, what did I do about this threat? Is this a white noise? Because you have to remember, they are using AI these days to penetrate through you. So they'll get inside your network. They're not going to act right away. They're going to sit down for 3 or 4 weeks, find out who your security admin, find out what your service account, and they just sit dormant. If you're not detecting this weird network of somebody trying to do someone, they'll go into another PC. They'll find out another vulnerability. Meanwhile, if you are not looking at these weird connections, stuff like that, you're going to be in the dark until they do the investigation of your network or your data, and then it'd be like, what happened? So I'll take a pause here, and I think
it's a great point, and we're not even really going to talk about this today, but I've talked many, many, many times about the kill chain and the life cycle of an attack and MITRE's attack matrix and all of these kinds of things. I think one of the most interesting phases of this is command and control. And being able, I'm again not really going to talk about this today, but our cloud perimeter security solution at Aviatrix is really designed to stop that command and control phase in the cloud. Today we'll talk about a few other things. I think injecting network traffic, when we think about compromised networks, really, really interesting, all sorts of different ways where you might not fully understand where the perimeter of your network lies. And then your comments around zero trust, right? And least privilege access. How do I prevent lateral movement? How do I block it at later stages? Very, very important. All of these are different phases of the attack. And if we can make an impact in any one of those, it can really mitigate our risk. And that's really what this is about, right? I mean, it's about how do we mitigate risk? How do we make it harder for the attackers? It's going to be a constant cat and mouse game. I think maybe to me, that's one of the things I love about cybersecurity is it's challenging, right? And critically important at the same time. Like you're making an impact. Now, I think one of the things that is really important, and in my opinion, the biggest shift from the Salt Typhoon kind of wake-up call here is this concept of shared responsibility. Now, this has been super popularized in the context of cloud. Like all of the cloud providers, AWS, Azure, GCP, they all have very delineated, outlined shared responsibility models. I think the critical important part here is like understanding where the line of trust needs to be drawn and what is your responsibility to this. So John, would love to get your thoughts on where we draw that line and where you would take ownership of your own security versus trusting the service provider. And does this incident shift your thought process there at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just highlights some of the best practices that you have to implement, right? So I would say in general, right, service providers, they're focused on connectivity, right, over security, right? They might sprinkle in security features, but their threat models, like you mentioned before, is quite different from enterprise's threat model, right? Where your trust boundary lies as enterprise versus a service providers is very different. So as an enterprise, you have to look at your security holistically from inside your network out and coming back to the cloud and coming back in. So I think, it just points to sort of a more rigorous threat analysis, right? Understanding what are the security guarantees your service providers implementing, and what do you need to do on top of that. So I think those are some of the keys. And, some of the challenges here really, I think Sarmed pointed out too, is there's a limitation in terms of visibility when you go from one environment to another and to another. So I think implementing a very good sort of monitoring detection system is critical in this environment as well.
And on point number 2, Sarmed, and any comments or thoughts with regards to what are some of the most effective ways you can enforce your own security policies on a network that you might not own?
Yeah. So going back to, again, like as I said, the tiers and stuff like that when we talk about, and really, I've been through, when we did evaluation of corporation, and there's some major 500 corporation, they are on the top of everything, and they still get penetrated through. And what we call is the language we use right now when we go to CEO or whatever is the mushroom cloud explosion. That mushroom cloud explosion when you get, so they all know, if you really talk to Fortune 500, they all know they're going to get, no matter what tools they put in there, they will be hacked one day because it's a user. It's a user vulnerability, third party, and informed. The question is how you can contain that cloud. What's your vulnerability? How quickly can cut off, isolate. And visibility is the most important when it comes to Aviatrix. When you talk about routers, you put the stuff like that, when you see those visibility, because if you don't know where that network access have to, you're not going to know how to contain what we call the mushroom cloud containment. This network have this visibility, this access, and the procedure of how you contain it. You go through that. We always tell client, make sure you do a dry run on your recovery once every 6 months, if not once every quarter. How are you going to react when that 0 day? Doesn't have to be your hack. The 0 day when a third party comes up and says, hey, we have an issue here, we don't have a solution for it. Okay, what are you going to do? Where are you going to contain? Because you still need to operate. You have to remember. You still need, if it is an IoT device in the manufacturing or is an IoT device in healthcare, you can't call them and say, oh, your cancer patient, they can't do an MRI image, whatever, because we have, you just can't do that. So you work with that containment and you go forward and you see, how can I contain and still go every day? And that's really the key is whether you're hacked or you're whether doing 0 day, what is my process? How my visibility is, how can I tell my management and the board, if you're a public company, you're going to put a statement out saying, we're 100% secure. How are you going to do that? What the proof on that? And just a little bit, if I may, most companies in a Fortune 500, believe it or not, they have a team. I've seen it. They have a team specifically hunt on the dark web to see what third party been hacked or have a vulnerability. They have not publicly said it. And they go and call them and say, give me what you got, even though you haven't told me. I've seen this. We just heard of the recent attack on you and then, been exploded and been asking for money. I know it's not publicly, but you are a third party and you have access to this network. They right away limit the third party and right away start acting. That's
so segmentation.
Yes.
Yeah. So segmentation, the ability to cut off the network, a critically important piece. I know one of the other things I think about oftentimes when we're looking at how do you secure a third-party network is kind of technical and relatively practical, but this concept of building overlay networks on top of other networks that you really do have control over. So you effectively take that encryption layer and up-level it and so that anything on the underlay network doesn't have the ability to break into the overlay network. And kind of the historic technology here is VPNs, which are been around for a really long time, but have obviously evolved over time. But the way that I kind of think about it is looking at, can I virtualize my network on top of another untrusted network and create those barriers And ultimately, we need to be able to do it in a way that we control and ideally encrypt as well. So practically, when I look at one of the big things, for this specific event, obviously, I think there's some broader things we can take away with regards to networking best practices. But one of the things that I think about is how do we take ownership of pieces of the network to move that trust boundary more to a place that's in our control versus one that was historically may be somewhat out of our control. And again, not the first time we've talked about encryption, especially to the cloud. And when we think about some of these really critical links that are crown jewel applications and a lot of our data is transferring over, how do we secure that is a really important topic. So we'll talk about two things here. MACsec, a technology that has really been focused on the encryption piece, not necessarily the overlay piece, which I think is maybe the important nuance here. Definitely highly used in organizations. There are many companies that I've seen that take these very critical links to the cloud and don't have encryption over them, or have certain service providers that they're working with that may give them virtual circuits, colo providers, things along those lines, don't have encryption over them. MACsec has historically been complex, but it does have some benefits in terms of the performance as associated with it. The big thing that I think is kind of an aha moment here that we need to think about with MACsec as an option is that the way that it works is that the encryption is a hop-by-hop encryption at layer 2. Like by definition, then we're talking about MACsec, right? MAC addresses, layer 2 switching. It's a port-to-port encryption. And so one thing that's important to think about as an enterprise, if you're thinking about using MACsec as an encryption methodology, is to understand where that decryption is happening. And if we're just thinking about connecting from your equipment to some third-party cloud provider equipment, or maybe even worse, some middle ground equipment and a colo provider that then is unencrypted, to John's point earlier, and that's where we start to lose that control of the end-to-end encryption. If the point of Salt Typhoon is that we shouldn't trust routers that other people own, this is technically a device that you don't necessarily own. And we need to think about how can we own all points of that encryption while maintaining visibility. Now, this is a place where Aviatrix has been really, really innovative. And so I do think there's another really, really interesting option for a lot of organizations. One of our proprietary technologies is something called high performance encryption, built on industry standards. It's an augmentation to IPsec. And so you're using the same tried and true encryption technologies, but you're not paying the performance benefit. This is one of the historic challenges, is that we have to pick security. We have to make trade-offs in security, especially when it comes to software-built VPNs. That trade-off historically in VPNs is performance, because you're terminating that VPN connection in the cloud on a device that's running in software, and it has limitations. Typically, that limitation is like a 1 to 2 gig performance limitation. Now, for many organizations, that's not sufficient. Our high-performance encryption technology allows us to do 10, 25 gigabits per second, and then you can even scale that out horizontally to get to hundreds of gigabits per second of encrypted traffic, where you own, as an organization, all ends of that encryption, right? So you can still get visibility, because anywhere points that it's getting decrypted is in a device that you own and that you are monitoring and that you are responsible for patching and that is secure. And we can utilize those service provider links for connectivity, but we can extend the trust boundary, right? So even if a device in the middle is compromised, it can't inject traffic into our VPN. It can't monitor traffic from our VPN. It can't extract data from that VPN. And what's really powerful about this is a super easy place for organizations to get started with Aviatrix. Our Aviatrix Edge device can be run on VMware. It can be run on Nutanix AHV. We have physical hardware that you can run it on. There's a lot of we partner with Equinix and with Megaport and a lot of the colo providers to make encryption with performance super, super simple, right? And you don't have to have specialized devices to do things like MACsec. So a couple different things that organizations can consider. If you don't currently have encryption on some of these critical links that traverse across a third-party service provider that you may not have control of, consider Aviatrix high performance encryption. We used to call this insane mode, which I love. HP, maybe a little bit more descriptive, maybe a little bit less fun, but really, really relevant and an interesting place for organizations to get started. Now, beyond that, again, one thing that it's not just, I want to help organizations make practical improvements in their security posture. My takeaway from Salt Typhoon is that this is one of the critical places, but we've talked in this conversation about a lot of other things. We've talked about segmentation. We've talked about zero trust. We've talked about visibility. The biggest thing that was really interesting to me was that, okay, cool, the Salt Typhoon attack was centered around service providers. It wasn't really, necessarily targeted at the enterprise, underlay networks necessarily, but as a result of the forensics, we talked about this earlier, an understanding of how deeply embedded some of these advanced persistent threats are in these underlying networks, and then the response from CISA, and not just from CISA, from the NSA, from the FBI, from the ASD, like the big time names in cybersecurity and recommendations come out with a broad guidance on what to do to secure your networks. So would love to get any comments that you have, Sarmed or John, on this new recommendation. Like, how do you treat a CISA recommendation? It's not really a compliance guide, but John, would love to get your thoughts. Like, when CISA comes out with guidance, it's not like mandatory for you as a non-federal organization, but what do you think about those types of recommendations?
Oh, I have a lot of respect for CISA. I think they're doing a great job, right? So when they come out with recommendations, it is top of mind for me, right? So I definitely look at it. And, when you squint your eyes a bit on these recommendations, this slide could have been from 2 years ago, 5 years ago, right? It's really security best practices that we've been preaching for a long time. And I think for CISA to call this out again just highlights the urgency. And it's definitely something that, we'll take action on.
So I would strongly recommend, as a follow-up, take a look at the CISA guidelines. It's not just about encryption, although we've talked about that today as a very practical piece. We've talked about where third parties connect into your network and building out DMZs. And we've got some really, really innovative solutions at Aviatrix to help build secure DMZs that have visibility, that give you that shut-off valve, that give you the ability to very granularly and dynamically control access. We've talked about segmentation. We talked about closing off your out-of-band management networks, all of these different types of things, lots of things that are relevant and very top of mind as we design our own products. And honestly, what a lot of organizations look at Aviatrix to do is not just to connect things. I view this as, how do we build a secure cloud networking fabric, right? One that has security embedded into the fabric with all of these foundational principles. If you don't have those capabilities, or you don't have cohesive control or cohesive observability or auditability in your cloud environments, there's a lot of things in this guidance that we think about as core value propositions of the Aviatrix product and invest a lot in development to help support. So it's very exciting to see just a rehashing of a lot of these best practice recommendations. Now, talked a little bit about segmentation. We've talked a little bit about encryption. We've talked a little bit about some of the quick wins with regards to Aviatrix high performance encryption and encrypting those uplinks with Aviatrix Edge. Again, we do have some super simple starter packages to help organizations make an impact here, and everything can be done in software, which is really, really exciting from a velocity perspective. You want to start checking off some of these boxes of this helped highlight a gap in my security posture. Aviatrix is absolutely here to help. Now, I do think there's certain industries, and oftentimes I think it comes down to data sensitivity that are particularly relevant here. So, Sarmed, any comments on where you see vertical? I know we've seen this be very specific. Several large financial institutions using us to encrypt up to the cloud. We have a number at Aviatrix of healthcare organizations. One of the core use cases is, especially in healthcare, that B2B use case where you're partnering with maybe a third-party clinic or a third-party software provider, a third-party contractor coming in and making sure that they have secure access to the applications in your cloud environment. Software companies as well, when you're extending SaaS offerings to third parties, and retail has been a big success for Aviatrix as well. Again, if you look at the theme here, it's sensitive data in finance, healthcare, and retail, and software is other people's data that you're hosting, and all of those come with like very specific compliance requirements. But Sarmed, any specific industries that you've seen be particularly sensitive and really important to take some of these pieces of advice into account?
Yeah, I just want to touch back first on the government, and we all need to go back. If you look at the history, we all look at the U.S. government for weak security guidance. They are the best in the. We all get them, and when the Treasury Department got hacked with this virus stuff like that, everybody was like, okay, so the thought is not you're never going to get hacked. You will be hacked one day because you have third party, you have all this, and what they emphasize on, if you look at the points right here, monitor visibility and identify your vulnerability. If you're not, and be honestly truth, there is not one solution. Aviatrix is one of the best tools they can do for you is you can deploy, Aviatrix Transit hub and spoke and put a virtual gateway, whether on a cloud or in your, hybrid, data center, but to see the traffic more when it leaves. But really, you need to identify vulnerability. You need to be honest with yourself and say, not like, for example, we go to some industry and they'll go back and say, well, this device is only doing this. This is not a threat to us. Well, the problem is that's what hackers do. They penetrate through your weakest link, but when they are in, they don't need to penetrate through your SQL server or your harness or your app on the cloud. That's not, they know you're protecting all that. They go through your weakest link, they get in, and once they are in, they start looking. Just sit and look. And if you're not monitoring your vulnerability, and if you're not, you don't have that, what we just talked about, knowing where your traffic is going, constantly monitor and knowing your vulnerability. When that mushroom cloud happened, what we call mushroom cloud, and then first thing they do, you just remember, when they come into your environment, when they take control, not just take your data, they cripple your DNS. You cannot hit any firewall. You cannot, if your firewall is someone else, if your DNS is completely changed, you got hacked, and domain control, you can't go anywhere. You start thinking like, what do I do? And if you don't have those plans in place, the dry run of my DNS is hacked, if this is hacked, because they don't just take your crown jewels. So going back to the industry, protect yourself from vulnerability, whether you're healthcare, whether you're, retail. It is not just, okay, I have an app on a cloud, I have this portal, I put all these tools and stuff like that. You need a tool that really have visibility on your network, whether LAN to another LAN, which is what we call it, internal WAN, or external WAN to the external cloud, and what have you going. And having that visibility, what Aviatrix provide for you, and it's the good thing about it, it's what Aviatrix, what I've worked with, I'm not trying to do a selling point here, but the advantage we see with Aviatrix in my learning when I went to certification with Aviatrix is how quickly you can deploy that virtual gateway and how you can quickly see the hub and spoke, and just on the cloud, you can see I have devices here that they're communicating. I don't know what they're doing. And you can quickly, penetrate to some of the cloud, network security posture that with your tools, and you'll be able to see where AWS or Azure doesn't give you. And knowing that visibility and knowing that communication, that how it is coming, whether it is communication, third-party tools on the cloud or internally where it need to connect to the cloud to be available to the client. You have to remember, all those tools coming in, they need to be able to be accessed through the third party to the client by an app or something. We don't have access to those. Most of the clients saying, fine, what do you need access to? Well, we need access to the internet, and this is secure out here, and we need access, and we are secure through this way. Okay, You give them the access and you give them that, and you think, well, they're secure. You don't have that protection on that, segmentation on that. What's going to happen?
Yep. So we're at time. I want to close this out with thank you very much, Sarmed. Thank you, John. Close this out with just kind of a quick recap. So what was the attack, right? I think the key is very persistent network access and some of the, the heart of the U.S. service provider infrastructure. And the practicality of this is that we're talking about some of the most advanced attackers in the world that are creating these exploits, right? And so, everybody has a responsibility to take security as much into their own control as possible. If I really generalize this, the issue is trust in third parties. And really, how do I apply levels of zero trust principles in my network architecture? So persistent network access in third parties that we may have historically trusted, and it's totally fine to continue partnering with, but just thinking about how do we improve our security posture or change the layer at which we're shifting that trust boundary. So we need to be thinking about that. And then parallel to that, how do we take our own networks, right, and make it harder for the APTs, if they do get in, to get what they want? And that's where we look at things like lateral movement control, controlling privilege escalation, making sure that we don't have areas where, if a router is compromised, it can have data interception or exfiltration, or even if it is, making sure that you have visibility into those devices and how they're behaving, which is a really, really interesting nuance, but something that is pretty unique about the way that Aviatrix is deployed is that you can also watch how those devices are behaving. So you have multiple different layers, defense in depth, all of that kind of stuff. The key here is we're mitigating business risk, right? I'll say, trust is such an important thing. And when any organization has data loss specifically, trust is something that can be broken. I know we take that incredibly seriously here at Aviatrix. With our own product security, with our own, everybody has issues with our own responses to scenarios and our own best practice recommendations, how we guide customers. But we also want to give you tools as an organization to bring full control of your own security posture into a network that you can manage, that you can monitor, that you can secure, that you can patch, that you can own. And that's, the outcome of this is reduction in business risk. I also think there's an ethical responsibility that we have as security practitioners to protect other people's data, right? I mean, it's trust for the business, there's money associated with it. But for me, just personally, I'm driven by the ethical foundation of making sure that we're doing the right thing by our customers. And that's, I think, it really motivates me personally. So there's a lot of value here. With Aviatrix, very high level, high performance encryption, moving that trust boundary, taking ownership of your encryption from your doorstep in your data center or physical location you own up into the cloud or between clouds, and really thinking about where we draw that trust boundary. Visibility, network segmentation, our distributed cloud firewall allow us organizations to apply zero trust principles in the cloud with regards to network access lists. Ultimately, this leads to lower business risk. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining today. If you want to learn more about the Salt Typhoon incident and some of the practical things that you can do with your network to improve your security posture, I'm also a big believer in practicality. How can I get started quickly? How can I make incremental positive impact? Don't try to overthink security. Make progress. And we give you some good recommendations on how to get started there. And then always we're willing to help consult with your team if you have questions about the product, if you have questions in general about how we see organizations improving their security posture by leveraging best practice network security and network configuration in the cloud, feel free to reach out to us. We would love to have a more detailed conversation with you. Sarmed, John, thank you very much for your time today. We really, really appreciate your insight, and we'll look forward to having more insight from you on future podcasts, future webinars. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.